Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's Shira. It's wonderful to see so many of you again, repetitive faces, and getting to learn together in this series. This morning, we are excited to be learning together with Rachel Sharansky Danziger. We will be learning Sefer Shmuel, Shmuel Aleph and Bet, Samuel 1, 2 together, kind of as one unit. Rachel is a writer, an educator, and really a master storyteller. Sort of reading your bio, I think that's really how I would love to describe you. As a real master storyteller and one who weaves together narrative and text in very profound ways. She is from Jerusalem, returning soon to Jerusalem, currently living in Boston. Her degrees are in philosophy and in history, and she has taught Tanach in lots of different venues, from new immigrants in Israel to Ma'ayan, the institute in Boston, Ma'ayan Torah Study Institute specifically for women. She is a 929 writer and teacher, and that's a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to learning in that context. She really weaves together connections between stories, religion, and emotions as both an educator in the wider community and as a writer and a blogger, both at Times of Israel, 929, Tel Aviv Review of Books, in lots of different online venues. And we're really honored and thrilled that she'll be sharing her insights into the book of Shmuel and the narratives of Shmuel together with us today. So thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for being here. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shira. I'm honored. It's lovely to see so many faces. It's hard. I can't see all of you at once, so I apologize in advance if I can't respond to everybody immediately. What we're going to do is every now and then I'm going to stop and look at the questions at the chat, and also we can we'll see how it goes. I'll try and develop some discussion, but if we see that it's too much to be able to do, then we'll just plunge ahead. But I want to start by asking a technical question. Can people hear me well? Please raise your hands if you can hear me well, okay, or something. Good, thank you. And now that we're done with the technical aspect of it, let's jump straight in. You had many of you I know already learned Shoftim, judges, yesterday. So you remember that we are plunging into the book of Shmuel on the heels of a terrible civil war. We watched the society, the Israelite society, breaking apart for over 200 years in the book of Judges. We watched people losing touch with previous generations, forgetting what God did to their parents and moving on. We watched people losing touch with other tribes, tribe not helping another tribe in its war or fighting against another tribe. We watched brothers losing touch with each other. We watched Gideon's children murdering each other. We watched a society alienating itself, breaking itself apart, raping, pillaging, and eventually fighting it all out. And the question is, what do you do moving forward? How do you fix that? How do you move out of it? And the truth is, at the end of the book of Judges already gave us a hint. It kept saying, in those days there was no king in Israel. In those days there was no king in Israel. Here, let's look at it for a second in the source sheet. A moment. Can everybody see it? I don't know if it's working.
We can see it if it just make it a little bit wider and bigger.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. The very last verse of the book of Judges, as you see in source number 1 here, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. So it's pretty much a nod, nod, wink, wink. This is where we're supposed to go. We need a king. But then instead of starting to tell us about, and then a baby was born, and God said he will be the king, or any of the other classic beginnings of stories of kingship, excuse me. Instead of talking about the national problems, instead of talking about the big arena of national politics, about the different tribes coming and creating an alliance, instead of any of those things, we delve headfirst into a family story. Let's look at it again. Here in a surprising beginning, source number 2. I'm just going to read it through in English, but you have it in the Hebrew. There was a man from Ramatayim of the Tzufit in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Yeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Tzuf, an Ephraimite. He had two wives, one named Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. What are we talking about here? What's going on? Civil war, tribes not handling the situation very well, enemies coming from without. What do we care about this one guy from this one place and the fact that he had two wives and one was childless and one was not? And the story continues in the same vein. This man used to go out from his town every year to worship and to offer sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Hophni and Pinchas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord there. Okay, so we have one family, the family of Elkanah and his wives. We have another family, the family of Eli, the priest at Shiloh and his sons. And we seem quite removed from the drama of the chapters that directly preceded this book. And the question is, why do we need it? Why do we need this family story? So on the most obvious level, on the most basic level, we need it because you can't just jump from a reality of the book of Judges to a reality of Kings without showing us how we got from point A to point B. And it so happens that the way we get from point A to point B is that the child who will be born to Elkanah's childless wife, Hannah, will grow up, become the leader of the people, Shmuel, will become a prophet, and as he becomes someone who accrues legitimacy and authority in the eyes of the people, he will be the man who will help them transition from a decentralized tribal society to a centralized kingdom under one king. In fact, he will anoint two and not one king, but we'll get to that soon. So in a sense, we need that. We need this part of the story to understand how we move from one state to another. Because as we saw in the book of Judges, the problem was lack of legitimacy, lack of authority. When one leader rises in one tribe, the other tribes don't rally around him. They don't see him as someone who's legitimately leading them. And we need to see how one person was able to accrue enough legitimacy and enough clout to be able to help the people, guide them together into this new direction. But if that's all we needed, the story could have started with, and there was a baby named Shmuel who grew up and became a prophet and a leader. Why do we need to start with his father going around and his mother starting off childless and his father's other wife having children? What's the story here? So perhaps in order to understand a little bit better why we're starting with this point, we should continue the story and look a little bit what happens after Elkanah takes his wife to Shiloh. So let's look again at the sources. I'm going to skip ahead to number 4 here, which is from the book of Shmuel 1, chapter 1, verses 9 to 14. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, and we're talking about Elkanah and his wives, Hannah rose. The priest Eli was sitting on the seat near the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. In her wretchedness, she prayed to the Lord, weeping all the while. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant and will remember me and not forget your maidservant, and if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. As she kept on praying before the Lord, Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up. So I'd like to ask you a question, and let's try and see if we can do it through the chat, if you can answer me through the chat. I'd like to ask you a question. What is Hannah? What actions is Hannah doing in this short passage that we just saw? Can we just enumerate the different actions that she's doing? Do you want to try and answer on the chat? She's praying, said Elliot, right? Prayer. Susanna also. Crying, making a request, a bakasha, weeping, going to the temple, weeping, sitting. She's actually not sitting. He is sitting, praying silently with only moving her lips, making a neder and a vow. I want to pause on that. Thank you, Ashira, who pointed out that. She is making a vow, and it's an unusual vow. There's a lot of chutzpah in Hannah's vow, because she's not saying, God, you're so great, help me. She's saying, let's do tit for tat. You do this for me, and I'll do that for you. In a sense, she's almost sounds like Yaakov. When Yaakov was leaving his family for the first time when he was on the run, fearing Esav's wrath, he made a similar vow. He said, God, if you go out with me and take care of me and be with me in my exile, I will do X, Y, Z. So Hannah is fashioning herself after quite an impressive lineage here. She's also negotiating, correct? She's despairing, she's pleading, she's echoing Yitzchak. Who said echoing Yitzchak? Would you like to elaborate on that? You can unmute yourself.
Actually,
I see.
can.
Yes.
If you prefer, I can let people unmute themselves.
Yes. So can you please?
I'm going to do that. Yeah, I'm going to let people unmute themselves. Hold on. Just be careful, everybody. But yeah, if you want to unmute yourself, you can. Oh, hold on. You also had unmute. You also had unmute yourself, Rachel, once I switched. Okay.
So who wrote Echoes of Yitzchak? Would you like to elaborate? I can only see that it's iPad. I don't know who it is. Okay, well, let's move on. If you want to speak up later, please do. Praying, only moving her lips. Somebody points out that the child of a barren woman is a classic biblical leader choosing, and we'll get to that in a minute. So we're seeing a lot of different things that people are pointing out here. Pleading, making a vow, leaving the family gathering. That's a very good point. And the text that I didn't bring that happens directly before that is when she is sad, when she is upset, while they're all sitting there eating the korban because she doesn't have children. Her husband tells her, but look, I love you so much. Isn't my love... Can everybody mute themselves, please? Please mute yourself. She is saying, I am so... she's telling her, isn't my love good for you as 10 sons? Isn't it as good for you as 10 sons? Why are you sad? But she rejects it. She doesn't accept that. She gets up and she walks. So the thing that really comes through out of all of that, all of these actions, is that Hannah refuses to sit idly. I'll look back at the chat soon. Let's pause with the chat for a minute. Hannah refuses to accept reality as it is. Hannah refuses to remain with her family. She refuses to remain seated while eating. She refuses to go through the normal process of doing things. She just gets up, leaves it behind, and davens, prays in this unusual way. That Eli, who presumably saw a thing or two in his long life as a priest in the tabernacle, is unfamiliar with. She breaks away from the familiar. Now let's look again at Eli in the same situation. In the same situation, what does Eli do? He is sitting on the doorpost. He's not standing, he's not walking, he's sitting. He is, if you look at verse 12, watching. In Hebrew, it says not watching, he says shomer, which is almost guarding. You really feel like he's like there trying to keep the peace, trying to make sure that the protocols are kept, that things stay the way they are. And when he thinks, that's his next action, he thought in verse 13, that she's going, that she's behaving in a way that's unseemly, that's inappropriate, he tells her off. He rebukes her. He judges her. That's the verb that isn't here but is implied. That Eli judges Hannah by a certain set of standards. Now, this contrast that we're seeing here between a woman who is active, who is breaking away, who refuses to accept the way things are and wants to change them. And a man who is sitting on the doorpost, trying to guard things the way they are, is a powerful image. In fact, it's an image that not only in Tanach, but in literature in general, it's an image that we often see at the beginning of an adventure. And Joseph Campbell, in his famous The Hero with 1,000 Faces, where he compared stories from far and wide, from different eras, from different cultures, he pointed out that that's, he doesn't refer to Eli and Hannah, but he says that there's this classic scene when the hero is called upon to go into adventure. And going into adventure means that you have to go out of the bounds of the familiar world, out of the bounds of the world you know, and experience new and dangerous things. So there's often this moment when the hero is about to cross a threshold into the unknown, but there's a guardian. He calls it a hold fast, somebody who's trying to hold things, keep them from changing. And the guardian, be it a dragon, a tyrant, a parent figure, a monster of some sort, tries to keep the hero from breaking free, tries to say, no, things should stay the way they are. You should stay where you are. This is the way things are. So in a sense, Eli here is assuming this role. He is trying to keep Hannah within bounds. And Hannah says, no, I refuse to accept the way things are. Somebody pointed out before, and I saw it as a running theme in your chat responses, that a birth of a child to a barren woman is an important motif in the biblical stories. We see it with Rachel, right? We see it with Sarah. We see it with Rivka. The only matriarch who gives birth easily is Leah and Zilpah and Bilhah, parallel to her. And there's a lot of Parshanuyot, there's a lot of explanations for that. Rashi famously says that, and following the Midrash, that God wants the prayer of the tzadikot, that God wants them to pray, the righteous women, and then once they pray, he gives them children. But in another level, we can look at it also like this. We can say that when a woman has to fight for her child, and it's not just a woman, by implication, it's also the husband, of course, when they have to fight to have fruit, to have continuity, it means that they have to rebel on some level against reality as it is. And on some level, this rebellion, and I wouldn't dare say that if it wasn't right there in the text, on some level, it means that they have to rebel against God. God created their barrenness, and they have to come to God and say, no dice, I refuse, please change that. I don't accept the way you made things. So in a sense, when God makes these righteous women barren, God invites us to act very much like Abraham acted when God told him about the upcoming destruction of Sodom, very much like Jacob acted when he stole the blessings, even though he was not the firstborn. God didn't allow him to be the firstborn. He's acting like, those women are acting like those patriarchs, and they're demanding of God a different reality. And by placing this scene and this demand at the very beginning of the book of Shmuel, the biblical storyteller is telling us something else. They're telling us the book we're getting into now, the story we're getting into now, will require people to rebel against the way things are. And we will come back to that. I know that right now I'm making a somewhat unsubstantiated claim, but we will keep coming back to it and enriching our understanding of that foundational image in the beginning of Shmuel. For now, it's enough to say that as Hannah's prayer is answered and she gives birth to this baby Shmuel, she keeps him for 3 years, she nurses him, she brings him to the tabernacle, and he grows up there in Eli's household, serving Eli and the tabernacle, just as she promised in her tit-for-tat vow to God, to Hashem. So he's growing up there, surrounded by Eli and his sons, Hofni and Pinchas, and we're watching something very interesting. We're watching a reality where Shmuel is rising while the house of Eli is falling down. And let's look for a second at the way it happens, because it will enrich our understanding of the opening and help us understand better what's going to happen next. I shall read here. It's in source number 5. It's Shmuel Aleph, chapter 2, 22-26. Now Eli was very old. When he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of the meeting, he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I get evil reports about you from the people on all hands. Don't, my sons. It is no favorable report I hear of the people of the Lord spreading about. If a man sins against a man, the Lord may pardon him. But if a man offends against God, who can obtain pardon for him?" I just want to pause and say that this is somewhat different from the way we understand tshuva, right? We understand that tshuva, when we do a sin against God, we only have to do tshuva. When we do a sin against men, we have to ask men to forgive us. That's just a thought to consider for later. But they, meaning the sons, ignored their father's plea, for the Lord was resolved that they should die. Young Samuel, meanwhile, grew in esteem and favor both with God and with men. So Eli, in this little vignette, does 2 actions. And those are actions we already saw him doing, right? He hears. We saw him before when he was perceiving Hannah. Then he was seeing, now he's hearing. It's a passive kind of action. He's perceiving. He's not creating, he's not acting. And then the only action he takes is talking. Just like before he rebuked Hannah, now he's rebuking his children. Note that he rebukes them far less harshly than he rebuked that woman crying and moving her lips in the tabernacle. This also gives us a hint into why the people need new leadership. So he's rebuking, he's hearing, he's rebuking. They disagree, they just ignore him, and he does nothing. Just like we saw him in the beginning, sitting and passive and just using words, but not really acting beyond that. Same thing here. He is sitting, he is perceiving, he is talking, he is doing nothing. But let's look at what Shmuel is doing. In the English, it says, meanwhile, young Shmuel, meanwhile, grew in esteem and favor. But in Hebrew, I'll read the parallel pasuk in Hebrew. Ve'ana'ar Shmuel, and the boy Shmuel, holech vegadel, is going and growing, walking and growing. It means that he's growing more and more. But the fact that the verb used here is holech, walking, is important. Because as we will see, and I'm giving you a little bit of a spoiler now, sorry, but as we will see when we will meet the king that will rise out of the book of Shmuel, King David, we will see that the verb that characterizes him constantly is walking, is leithalech, walking, walking, walking. Something about that, about the active sense of walking, is what characterizes the leader that God chooses. And in fact, God sends someone to tell that to Eli himself. If you look at the next source, God tells Eli, and when he tells him, your house will fall, your house cannot stand. And he says, and I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will act in accordance with my wishes and my purposes. I will build for him an enduring house, and he shall walk before my anointed evermore. What we need is a leader who walks, is a leader who, like Hannah, is not afraid to leave the family gathering, leave the familiar world, cross the threshold, fight the guardian monsters, and break things apart, make things anew. We don't need someone who's so invested in the status quo and in the way things are that he sits still and keeps things the way they are. We want to break away from the book of Judges. We need to do that. We need to actively do that. And this takes us back again to that scene where we saw Eli and Hannah, and we see the seeds of the destruction of Eli's house, because his house is sinking with the status quo that no longer serves justice, no longer serves God, no longer serves the people. And we see the seeds of Shmuel, who comes from this rejection, Hannah's rejection of the way things are, and willingness to stand up and fight for what she wants. But this is not it. in case we didn't really get the point, in case we are still kind of not clear on what's the contrast that the book of Shmuel wants us to keep in mind, the book portrays Eli's death in a way that really nails it all together. Let's look again. There's a battle against the Philistine. The Philistines were living on the seaboard, on the seashore, and they're invading into the hill land and into the mountains where the Israelite tribes are strong. Eli's children, Eli's two evil sons, corrupt sons, go with the people, and they take with them the Ark of the Covenant. And Eli is waiting for news to hear what happens at the battle. So let's look at what he's doing, and it's in Samuel 1, chapter 4, verse 13. When he arrived, he is the man who came from the battle to say that Eli's sons died, that the people lost, and that the Ark of Covenant was taken. When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on a seat. Just as he started, just as he got into the story, sitting on the seat, he's coming out of the story, sitting on the seat, waiting beside the road. Again, he is passive. He is waiting. He is not creating the news. His heart trembling for the Ark of the God. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. The man is giving his news, and then in verse 18, when he mentioned the Ark of the God, Eli fell backwards off the seat behind the gate, broke his neck and died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had been a chieftain of Israel for 4 years. So Eli dies as he lived, sitting, waiting, hearing news that he is unable to shape for himself. And out of this destruction, out of the fall of Eli's sort of leadership, rises Shmuel and starts walking. And I didn't bring the source, but you can check it later for yourself. He starts walking and traveling from city to city to city, leading the people, judging the people, educating the people, doing all the things that Eli in his sedentary life wasn't doing. And in this way, Shmuel accrues legitimacy. And at the end of his life, the people come to him and say, give us a king. And now the scene from the beginning and the contrast between taking initiative, being dynamic, breaking apart from the status quo, and being sedentary will assume a whole different meaning. But before we delve into that, I'm going to look at the chat and respond to some of your comments and questions. People point out, okay, just a moment. Sorry. People point out that Hannah cedes her child to Hashem. That is true. Oh, I see that people, sorry. Ashira pointed out that it's like Jacob after the vision with the ladder. Moment. Oh, I see that echoes of Yitzchak, barren women praying, deciding his future. David Gelber wrote, from a classical viewpoint, it would seem as though the book is setting us up for the birth of a savior. I find it curious that this ends up not being the case. Could this perhaps be a commentary on various hero myths? Heroes must work to be heroes. They need to grow. They don't start as heroes. Perhaps this is the point of contrast between Eli's children and Shmuel. One might expect them to be great, and yet we will see that they do not live up to their lineage. This is very true, and I think that it's in fact very common both in real life and in the Tanach that the children of great people don't quite rise up to their parents' standards. In fact, 929 is going to have a podcast about it soon enough, but it's a common theme. We will see it when we get to the second part of Shmuel Bet. We will see it with David's children, for example. In fact, we will see it with Shmuel's children, that the people who admire Shmuel and follow Shmuel don't feel comfortable with his children. They want a king instead. They don't want Shmuel's children to be their leaders. There's something about the hero who grows up and raises himself up and pulls himself by his bootstraps that makes him or her able to lead the people in a way that somebody who's just born into the position
can't do. In fact, this is going to be one of the major problems of all the books of the next few books of Tanakh. Because if we ended Shiftim with chaos and anarchy and decentralization, what we will see once we have centralization is kings leaving their passing on power to their children, and the children messing up. And we will get to that in a second. Rebecca Rodenberg pointed out that this son is like Yitzchak, as he is dedicated to a sacrifice. That's a very beautiful insight. E. Zinberg pointed out that sitting at the door, like Eli is sitting at the threshold, is like the judge is sitting at the shar. It's true that it's like he's sitting at the shar, but I think that here it's also that he's guarding the interior. There's he's a separation between the world outside and the interior. Joyce Solomon pointed out that being barren at the time was not just a physical condition. It means that you have no role in society. You have no place in society. Aline Yolkut pointed out an example of Deborah Tannen's thesis. He's the typical man who wants to fix things rather than listening and supporting her feelings. That's funny that he wants to help her fix the problem and not. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having a lot of difficulty here with the chat.
If you want, you can leave the chat until later if you prefer, and just go on and do the chat at the end. And I can help you. I can read the questions to you afterwards if you prefer.
Okay, so let's do that because it just stuck. I can't.
That's what I recommend anyway. So go on, and then at the end of the class, I'll forward you the chat question.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody mute, please.
Okay. So we started with Hannah and Eli and this contrast between demanding something new and being loyal to what is. We saw how those attitudes led them to very different outcomes. We saw how Shmuel rises out of the destruction of Eli's sort of leadership. And now we see that the people are coming to him and demanding that he anoint a king for them. Shmuel is unhappy. Shmuel is very, very unhappy. Shmuel he feels that he is being rejected. And when he comes to God with this complaint, God tells him, no, it's not you they're rejecting me. And here perhaps we're hitting the core of the problem that the book of Shmuel is trying to solve for us with partial success. The Jewish people, the Israelite people, cannot continue in the way they went on for the 200 years of the era of the judges. This was unsustainable. They were too weak. They were prey to any rising power around them or amidst them. They were disunited. And furthermore, without some sort of centralized leadership and learning, every generation lost the lessons that the previous generation bought at such dear cost, overcoming enemies, overcoming hardships, returning to God. So we see a disconnect that just continues from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. This is not sustainable, neither politically, in terms of survival, nor in terms of keeping God's covenant, because we see that they fail at passing the covenant from generation to generation. So we need centralized government. But once we have a centralized government, what will happen? Will the centralized government serve God? What if a king stops serving God? Will he lead the people astray? The answer is obviously yes, as we will see in the book of Kings, as we will see in the history of the destruction of Jerusalem. This is exactly what's going to happen, that the kings are going to lead them astray. But now that we already developed this language here in this forum of talking about Hannah and Eli as rejecting the status quo versus preserving the status quo, we can talk about the danger of kingship on a deeper level. Because what the era of the judges did allow people that a time of kings doesn't allow is the somewhat open horizons of lack of structure. When structures fail, when things fall apart, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to try and figure out what's the right way. It's an opportunity to correct your path, to say this path is not working for us, so let's correct it. It's an opportunity to call out to God and say we need help. The second you have a king, you have a system, you have a judiciary, you have everything in place, it becomes its own kind of status quo. It becomes its own kind of what Joseph Campbell calls hold fast, that monster on the threshold. It becomes invested in its own success. Yoram Chazani, in his book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, points out that throughout the history of Israel, as described from Genesis till the end of the book of Kings, and then referred to in the prophets, one thing keeps coming up as a running motif or as a running theme throughout, namely that God doesn't want us to be like the big nations, the big empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Those big empires that were built near a river, and they were what he calls empires of grain. They needed to be defended by an army from pirates and Mongols, nomads. They needed, so they needed an army, they needed a king. The king needed to support his army, so he needed to collect taxes. They had an apparatus of state that was massive, and we know that from the archaeology and from the stories that we inherited from them. And what happens when you have such a ingrained empire with such a strong apparatus of state is that it is invested in defending itself. People no longer ask questions like what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral. People ask, will that be good for us or will that be bad for us? Does that fit our lifestyle as a state or does that break us apart? And from the moment that God calls unto Abraham and tells him, Lech lecha, leave all of that behind and keep walking, keep changing allegiances, keep not staying in one place and building a sedentary way of life that you then have to defend and then becomes its own justification, but rather break apart, be different, be other. From that moment on, God constantly calls upon us to not allow these perverse effects of settling down to blind us to truth, to right and wrong, to God's will for us. God doesn't want us to grow so comfortable and settle down that we're no longer able to leave it all behind, to break it all apart when truth or right or God calls for it. You can later look at the source sheet. We're short on time, so I'm not going to read it out loud, but it's in the source sheet, the Yoram Chazani quotes. So the danger is that the book of Shmuel will take us away from the anarchy of Shoftim and instead leave us with a status quo that will become so settled, so set in its ways, that people will no longer be able to seek what's right and what's true. And Shmuel is unhappy about that. Shmuel warns the people that if they get a king, the king will exploit them. Shmuel warns the people that if they get a king, the king is not going to be able to save them if they no longer worship God. The king will die as well if they no longer worship God. But the people don't want to keep living like that from generation to generation, having to figure out a system every time. They want a set system that will give them some sort of continuity. And somehow Shmuel is supposed to give them that without abandoning them to the warping effects of a status quo. And perhaps this is exactly, going back to the scene of Eli and Hannah, this is why we needed Shmuel to grow up from the actions of a woman like Hannah, who breaks the status quo, who rebels against the status quo, who rejects the status quo, because we need someone who's sensitive to that, who's walking all the time, who's on the move, who takes initiative, who, like David pointed out before, is a hero who has to grow himself up. So he wouldn't leave us with a system that's too sedentary and too Eli-like to go back to the beginning. So how is he going to do that? That is the core problem of Shmuel. And the answer, it seems, that the book of Shmuel is giving us is somewhat surprising. It tells us that we need a certain type of man as a king for it to work. But the way the book of Shmuel tells us that is not by dictating that. It's not by telling us, oh, this is how you solve the problem of having continuity, but not having a, warping, perversive, corrupt status quo, but rather by showing us a failed example, by showing us a king who's chosen and then rejected by God. And that is King Shaul. Because the first man that Shmuel chooses is a young man from Binyamin, who is described in the very beginning as excellent, as good, as beautiful, as kind, as showing filial duty to his father. When his father asks him to go and look for lost asses, he does so. When his father worries about him, he's concerned about it. And he seems like a great candidate. And in many ways, he is. He is a good man. When the people are in trouble, he leads them in victory against their enemies. He doesn't seem to be a sinner. He doesn't seem to be corrupt. And yet God rejects him. And the reason God rejects him is fascinating. As we're familiar from reading it in the famous Haftarah, King Shaul is told by Shmuel to go and fight against Amalek and destroy them completely, annihilate Amalek. Shaul leads the people, he wins the war, and he does not annihilate them completely. He allows the people to keep the animals, and he doesn't kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And when Shmuel comes, Shmuel is incredulous. Shmuel says, isn't it good enough for you that God shows you? Why are you not following God's instructions? And the truth is, and because we're trying to cover two biblical books, I didn't have time to really bring all of these sources for our perusal here, but the truth is that this is already the second time something like that happens to Shaul. Before that, Shmuel asked him to go fight against the Philistine, but told him, wait for me, and then Shaul didn't wait for him. And in both cases, when Shmuel confronts Shaul and tells him, why did you not follow the instructions? Shaul says, the people were pressuring me. The people were leaving. I needed to lead them. I needed to do something. Or the people didn't want to kill the animals, so I let them keep the animals. Now, a classic interpretation of what's the problem here focuses on the fact that he's not taking responsibility on himself. That a real leader, like we will see with David, and we will get to that, takes responsibility when he sins. He acknowledges it. But there's another layer to it. A man who is so afraid of leading, a man who is so afraid of setting out and saying, no, this is what we're doing, and we're going to do that. How is he supposed to lead the people? He becomes, in a sense, so immersed in keeping his position, his king, by pleasing the people, that he can no longer lead. And then when God goes and chooses a new king, King David, and we'll talk about him in a moment, when God sends Shmuel to illicitly, secretly anoint another man as the rightful king, and Shaul starts seeing that that man, David, who becomes part of his court, is beloved by the people, Shaul starts persecuting him. And again, we see this lack of inner confidence. We see that Shaul does not feel confident. That Shaul is invested in keeping his position, keeping himself in power, and he cannot, he does not have that inner, shall I call it spine, that sense of himself to allow him to be a leader of the people. And in terms of what we were talking about before, in terms of the status quo, he becomes obsessed with keeping the status quo, where he is the one in power, over doing what's right, being fair to David, following God's and Shmuel's orders, etc. And at this point, God rejects him. At this point, God chooses David. And it's in David that we see the culmination of that big process that we saw from the beginning with Eli and Hannah, because David is the man who never sits down. David is the man, well, never say never, we'll get to that in a second, but David is the man who constantly walks, who constantly takes action. The first time we meet David after he is anointed is in the famous scene when he kills Goliath. And in that scene, Goliath the Israelites are on one side, the Philistines are on the other. Goliath, the giant, dressed in this armor and these heavy metals, comes out and says, curses God, says, come, fight with me, fight with me. Nobody dares to challenge him. And David goes and challenges him. And David says, I can do it. And at first, Shaul tries to dissuade him. Then Shaul agrees. If you look here in number 7, the second source in number 7. So Shaul tries to prepare it. And it's in verse 38. Shaul clothed David in his own garments. He placed a bronze helmet on his head and fastened a breastplate on him. David girdled his sword over his garment. Then he tried to walk, but he was not used to it. And David said to Shaul, I cannot walk in these, for I am not used to them. So David took them off. He took his stick, picked a few smooth stones from the wadi, put them in the pocket of his shepherd's bag, and sling in hand, he went towards a Philistine. And famously, with that wildly inadequate equipment, he brought about victory and killed the giant by shooting him from afar. The significance of this moment can't be overstated, because what David is doing here is not just proving that he's brave. It's also proving that he does not simply accept the terms of engagement offered to him. When Shaul thinks about sending David to fight with Goliath, he's trying to make David prepared in Goliath's terms. Goliath is there clearly getting ready for a hand-to-hand battle. He has his sword, he has his armor. So Shaul is trying to create a champion who can also fight him hand-in-hand battle. David says, no, under these terms, I can't win. He says, why do I need to accept these terms? He goes and he just steps aside, decides that he's going to fight from afar and use his ability to shoot over his inability to defeat Goliath in battle, and does that. And as David Wolpe points out in a great book, David the Divided Heart, this is a motif that runs throughout David's life. Other people are trying to figure out, yes, as Suzanne Levin says, think outside the box. Other people are trying to figure out the situation as it seems. He says, no, I'm just going to delete the board, start afresh. You know, once he rises into power, Shaul dies in battle with Philistines. Shaul's son is murdered. David becomes the king of all of Israel. I'm skimming over vast parts of the story here, but this is what we do when we have 1 hour to discuss 2 books. David becomes king of all of Israel. Everybody's waiting with bated breath to see, where is he going to set his capital? Is he going to set his capital in Judah, in the area of his tribe, and thus alienate all the other tribes? Or is he going to set it with the other tribes and thus perhaps betray the trust of his own tribe? Is he going to be a tribal king or a king of everybody? Is he going to succeed? What does he do? He conquers the Jebusite city and builds his capital there. He just refuses to accept these choices that are offered to him. He wins his wars. Does he just sit at home? No. He says, okay, now it's the time to bring the Ark of the Covenant back and build a house for God. He refuses to just sit still. He's constantly walking. He is the intellectual and spiritual heir of Shmuel before him and Hannah from the beginning of the story. And perhaps this is what the book is trying to tell us, that the only way to have a king, to have a centralized government, to have continuity, without it becoming the kind of warping, enclosing, ruinous status quo that we saw with Eli in the beginning, without it becoming the cause of persecution, as we saw happened when Shaul persecuted David, is to choose a king who is himself prone to disregard the status quo, to disregard the way things are and take initiative and change things. Now, just as it is true on the tactical, political level, it's true of David on the moral level. In the one great sin of David's life, the moment when he sees a beautiful woman washing herself on a roof, takes her, despite her being married, impregnates her, and then when she is pregnant, comes up with a scheme after trying to pass off the baby as her husband's child and failing, coming up with a scheme to get her husband killed and taking her for himself, namely the famous story with David and Bathsheba. Natan the prophet comes and tells David, famous fable about a poor man who had a lamb and took care of her, and then a rich man who had a lot of lambs took this one lamb to kill it. And David says the man should die. David is very, very harsh in his response, and Natan famously tells him, you are this man. You took the lamb of Uriah. You have so many wives, you have so many things, and you took the lamb. You are like that. And David, unlike Shaul in a similar situation when accused by God, says, here we are in Shmuel 2, 12, 13. I'll read it in Hebrew. Vayomer David el Natan chatati laHashem. David said to Natan, I stand guilty before the Lord. More accurately, I sinned to God. And Natan replied to David, the Lord had remitted your sin, you shall not die. David is able to, just as he is able to change tracks politically, tactically in a battle, in the strategy of uniting the people by putting the capital not where people expect, he's able to change tracks morally. But if the book ended here, we could say, okay, great, done. We found the right king. We found a king who's able to be active, reject the status quo, blah, blah, blah. Victory, moving on. But the book doesn't end here. Far from it. Because what we see from a little bit before that conversation with Natan is a decline. If the first part of the arc of the story shows us how great David he is, how wonderful he is, how innovative he is, how chosen, how beloved he is, everybody loves him. Even Shaul loves him and hates him, but loves him as well. Then we start seeing David losing his grasp on events. And the way he's losing it, again, takes us back to the beginning, to the contrast between Hannah's activism, dynamism, and Eli's investment in the status quo. Because the way David is losing it is by becoming more like Eli than like Hannah. It starts when the people are going to war and he doesn't. And let's look at it for a second. The people are going to war, and it's in source number 8. I'm not going to read it. We don't have time for this, but it's right here. You can see it. David is going to war and he stays home. He is passive. He is not leading. He is not taking initiative. And that's when he sees Bathsheba washing and feels temptation. Later, after this whole story, once Bathsheba is already his wife, she lost her first baby, we see a horrifying story where Amnon, Prince Amnon, son of David, desires Tamar, daughter of David, or sister of his sister, at any rate, and rapes her. And then brutally, after raping her, throws her out and shows no care for her, no willingness to support her, no nothing. And we see David's response is not to respond. Avshalom is the one leading the response. You can see here in Shmuel 2, 13, 20, 22, Avshalom is acting, talking, taking care of her, wondering about her. Let's look at verse 21. It's here in the middle. When King David heard about all this, he was greatly upset. Vayichar lo me'od. Usually in biblical stories, when you hear that, a description of emotion, it's followed by an action or a speech. Here, there's this ringing, loud silence where there should be some response and there's none. Is it really any wonder that following that, Avshalom, brother of Tamar, Avshalom, brother of Tamar, takes matters into his own hands and waits 2 years and then kills Amnon? And again, David doesn't respond. Avshalom runs away, and David doesn't do anything until other people prod him into summoning Avshalom back. And even then, he keeps him at a distance. He doesn't let him come to court until Avshalom prods other people to prod David to get him back. And we see that David, the man who was the one who walks, who takes initiative, is just there. He's not managing his children. He is an absent father to his children, in a sense. And it's from that failure that Avshalom decides to take matters into his own hand and starts the great rebellion that will be the second great escape in David's life. If David spent the first part of his life escaping his father figure Shaul, now David has to run away from his son Avshalom. And the rebellion culminates in a horrifying scene when David's people and Avshalom's people are about to go to do battle, and David doesn't go to fight. David sits down between the gates. This is literally the description. He sits down between the gates after asking the people not to kill Avshalom in battle, but if they see Avshalom, not to hurt him. And he sits there. Let's look here. It's in Shmuel Bet 18:4-24, but I'll look just at the last verse, 24. David was sitting between the two gates, just like Eli in the beginning of the story, just like Eli waiting for news from a battle before dying. David is sitting between the new gates. And because he is passive, because he's not in battle, he can't carry his will. He can't bring about Avshalom's survival. He is passive, and his general Yoav takes matter into his own hand and executes Avshalom, bringing about great grief to David. This is the culmination of passivity and a leader's, passivity, again, lack of initiative, acceptance of the way things are, instead of taking them in hand and trying to create what can be instead. So is that it? I'm sorry, it sounds like a very depressing ending for such a promising book, isn't it? And for a moment, it looks like it is it. David wins this war and he's taken back to Jerusalem, but it all feels kind of depressing. It feels kind of sad. Then at the end of his life, at the last chapter of the book, he counts the people, knowing he's not supposed to do that. He counts the people, and God sends prophet Gad and tells him, you have to choose either pestilence or war or famine. He chooses pestilence. And it really looks like he lost his ability to shape reality around him. Furthermore, when the prophet God comes and tells him that you have to choose one of these disasters as punishment, he says these curious words. He says, Tsar li me'od. It's very narrow for me. I am in dire straits. Fine, I choose pestilence. He feels like the world is crushing on him, and he's choosing one of the options God gives him. The man who always was able to not choose one of the options on the table, but rather create a new and better one, is now just accepting God's verdict and reality as it is. Furthermore, in doing that, he is echoing the only other man in the Bible who said Tsar li me'od, which was King Shaul on the eve of his death, when he goes to I'm not going to go into this whole backstory, but he goes to the medium of Endor, brings up the spirit of Shmuel, tells him, what should I do? Tsar li me'od, it's so narrow, the Plishtim are coming, I can't win. And Shmuel tells him, there's nothing you can do, you're going to die. And he accepts that. So is that it? Does the book just bring David to the same position? Does the book really leave us believing that you can't be in power and not be corrupted by it and not become sedentary and passive once you're at the height of control? No. Because in an act of last act of defiance, David, looking at his people dying in this pestilence, refuses. And one last time, rejects reality as it is. And this is in number 9 in Shmuel Bet 24:17. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I alone am guilty, echoing his admission after Bathsheba. I alone have done wrong. But these poor sheep, what have they done? And here it's a throwback to his beginning as a shepherd. Let your hand fall upon me and my father's house. At the end of this book, at the end of the story, David proves that he is made of Hannah's metal, that he is made of Shmuel's metal, and demands change, rejects the offer God gave him and says, no, give me something else. Do something else. I refuse to accept that. And then God says, okay, go and buy this particular piece of land and bring me sacrifices there. And this piece of land will become the foundation of the temple. The temple, the place where we pray to God, where we have a relationship with God, the place that we're mourning, that we're starting to mourn tonight. We're already mourning, but we're starting to mourn more seriously tonight, and that we will fast in mourning of next week, is built on the place that symbolizes, that stems out of David's refusal to accept the way things are. In other words, when God calls upon us to worship him, he doesn't ask us to do it in a sedentary and passive way, sitting on the threshold and sticking to what is familiar. He asks us to do it by demanding something better, like the mothers in the Bible who pray for a child, like Hannah who rises and demands, like David who at the moment of the pestilence says, no, even though you, God, decreed that, I refuse to accept it. And perhaps this is the book of Shmuel's answer to the big question of how can we have continuity and status quo without it becoming a warping, solidifying things that corrodes our ability to tell right from wrong. Perhaps what we need is to inoculate ourselves against the effect of the status quo by remembering that the dynasty, that the temple, that all those big institutions are founded on through a person who was the living example of a rejection of the status quo. And as long as we remember that, as long as we stick to that, as long as we hold on to that memory, perhaps we can be guardians not against change, but against the corrosive effect of a state apparatus that is just invested in perpetuating and defending itself. So, okay, so I have a few more words for summary, but I'd like to refer to people's comments and questions before we finalize. Rabbi Kalman, could you read the questions to me?
Okay, so I've been sort of going through them and trying to put them a little bit here together, but one theme that comes up a lot is the relationship between...
Rabbi Kalman, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me? I should be. Okay. One of the themes that seems to be coming up in a lot of the comments is the relationship between leadership and family. How difficult it is. Leaders often have to choose between their family and their leadership. Passing on, the children become corrupt perhaps. And tying in, I also saw the question, then why would they want a king? Because a king is the most obvious type of leadership that gets passed on from father to child. So if they don't like children, so perhaps you can address that whole issue of leadership, children, family, Moshe Rabbeinu's family, we know the problem, etc.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because it's really at the core of what we're talking about here, that there's they're kind of stuck between what's the expression in English? Something in a hard place.
Between a rock and a hard place.
Between a rock and a hard place. You can't not have centralized government and expect to succeed. The Book of Judges put that thesis to rest. We can't really have a free-form society, not in the ancient Middle East at any rate. It's not working. And between the external enemies and the internal forgetting of the covenant and loss of connection between people, it's just not going to work. So you do need some sort of centralization. And kingship is the most obvious way to restore continuity from generation to generation, and thus perhaps allow us to learn from the mistakes of one generation and implement it, because it has this element of inheritance, of bequeathing, of having a certain continuity that isn't challenged every time somebody dies, but rather continues. That's in the terms of the ancient world. Of course, I'm not comparing it to today. I'm saying in the terms of the ancient world, this was the one obvious way to promise continuity. And continuity was a problem. You know, we didn't have really time to go into it, but one of the things we see at the end of the Book of Judges, and Yael Ziegler talks about it in her book about Megillat Ruth, is that people lose their names. It starts when people stop being introduced as son of, but rather just by their first name. But then later, the people themselves are introduced just as the Levite maid from here and the concubine from there. They lose their identity. Somehow, without the connection to the past, without the ability to point out to family genealogies, people eventually lose what gives them identity as unique individuals also. They lose their place in the story. And if we go back to the very beginning of the book of Shmuel, what do we know about Elkanah, his father? We know more than what I implied before. Before I said that we know that Hannah rejects the status quo, refuses to accept the way things are. This is all true. But what we know is that his father is someone who does know who his parents are, and does, like here he is presented as Elkanah, son of Yerucham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Tzuf, son of Ephati. We know that he's a person who knows his tradition. He goes to the Mishkan over and over and over again. Somehow we need to combine this sense of past and continuity, and Hannah's rebelliousness, in a sense, Hannah's refusal to accept the way things are. So there's no perfect way. Getting a king is clearly a compromise. Shmuel is unhappy about it. God presents it in very negative terms. And as we will see in moving forward to the book of Kings tomorrow, it's a compromise that doesn't always work. In fact, slowly it degrades until it leads to the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the dynasty, and to exile. But within the context of their life and within the context of what they're trying to achieve, this was the best they could have. It is interesting. I want to quote Michael Walzer, who wrote an amazing book in God's Shadow. And in the beginning of the book, he talks about how in the beginning of the Bible, we meet a family, and that's a family of David. And there's a lot of tension over the question of inheritance. But what they're trying to bequeath from generation to generation is a covenant. It's not power over other people necessarily. There's a blessing that one day you will have power, but that's not the point. The point is a way of life, a certain relationship with God. Then the story opens up, and for 4, 5, 6 books, from Shmot, Vaikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, Yehoshua, Shoftim, even though there are individuals that stand out, we're talking about not a family, but rather the entire people. When we narrow the story down again through the book of Shmuel and then moving forward to the family of the king, to the royal family passing power from generation to generation, we're losing something. We're losing this sense of we're talking about the history of the entire people and everybody can be powerful and everybody can influence reality. But we have to do that or be lost altogether. So this is just a few thoughts on that.
Okay, just what else did I see here pointed out? Interesting point on passivity, comparing also Yaakov Avinu by Shechem, not doing anything, waiting to Ruvain. And I think someone's asking, what do you think caused David HaMelech to sort of move into a more passive mode?
So first of all, yes, it's an excellent example. I didn't think about it, about the parallel to Shechem. So thank you for pointing that out. I naturally cannot presume to know what David HaMelech was thinking, but I think that a lot of times the biblical storyline uses the smichut, when things are near each other, to give us hints about things that are not stated clearly. So the story of Amnon's rape of his sister follows directly the story of David's relationship with Bathsheba. And perhaps we can deduce from that David, when he saw his son misbehaving sexually, felt that he can't rebuke him because his hands are not clean, because he just suffered through the consequences of making a different yet similar sin and being told off for it, and maybe he felt that he's not the right person to move the story forward, that he doesn't have the right to do it. Maybe that's just one way to think about it. We can explore other ways separately later.
Okay, one other thing, I'll combine two things. Somebody at the pointing out how David, like Moshe Rabbeinu is a shepherd, the relation to animals. Someone pointing out actually the Makom Tsar is in Parshat Balak. Bilam is standing, is the Makom Tsar. I don't know if those two are really related, but just in animals, I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then perhaps you can sort of do your quick summary that you wanted to make.
Sure. I can't really comment on the Bilam thing without rereading it myself right now. But what I do want to say about narrowness in general, that in the biblical story, in the entire corpus of Sifrei Tanach, narrowness is a common theme, a common motif, a common setting, in a sense, for the moments that lead to either birth or death. I mean, it's obvious, right? You're in the womb or in the tomb. It's similar. It's a narrow place. And we have the idea, of course, that David HaMelech says, Mina Metzer, not David HaMelech, sorry. We have the idea of Mina Metzer Karatiyah, right? I call to God from the narrow places, Anani B'merchavya. He answers me in the wide places. We have the idea that Mitzrayim Mitzrayim, is a place of narrowness. It comes from the word tsar, mitzarim. We're now in the days in the year called Bein HaMitzarim. We're in the narrow place, right? Where we're suffering the pain of destruction and exile, and we're praying to be out of here already. So all those moments of narrowness, they're very dangerous moments because they might lead to despair. They might lead the Israelites in Egypt to forget their identity altogether. And in the Midrash, there's a long tradition that they were almost totally assimilated in Tum'ah, totally lost touch with their heritage. If you're Shaul, feeling like you're in this narrow place, you might just despair and walk to your death and feel like there's nothing else you can do. If you are in the process of birth, you might die in birth. You might die in that moment of hanging between life and death. But if we keep walking, if we pass an arrows, if we refuse to just sit down and die, as the expression goes, and it's appropriate in our discussion of Chana and Ali, if we refuse to just sit down, if we keep walking just a little further, then that moment of narrowness can be the birthplace of new ways, of new opportunities, of a new and better world. And at that moment, we make the choice, and really it takes me very neatly into my summary of what I wanted to say. It takes us directly to the one choice that we all have to choose, not just leaders like David and Shaul, but everybody like Hannah. Everybody in their own personal life have this one choice in those moments of narrowness. Do we look at things as static, or do we look at them as dynamic? In the source sheet, I brought a quote from a very interesting thinker, Robert Grudem, from a book called Time and the Art of Living. I don't have time to read it right now. I strongly encourage you to go there. Where he points us that one of the problems that people have in their relationship with time is that they treat things that are not static as static. The way he says it is that we look at reality and we turn it into still pictures in our mind. We look at a person being a certain way, let's say a good person, and we think that's it. That's a good person. We look at a person having a challenge or difficulty or sinning, and we say, this is it. This is a sinner, or this is a weak person, or this is a challenged person. And once we do that, once we transform a dynamic living reality into a set of still pictures around us, there's no place for choice, there's no place for change, there's no place for renewal. And the gift of individuals like Hannah and David, the gift that we all aspire to as we learn from these stories and are inspired by them, is to stop doing that, to stop looking at reality as static, but rather recognize that everything, the pitfalls, the falling short moments, the challenges, the horrible narrow places are all just one stage. But if we want to get to the next stage, we have to keep walking. We can't sit down. And with that, my wish for you, all of you, is that we will have many more opportunities of learning. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's class and learning about kings, but also that as we are in these days of narrowness and Beit HaMitzarim, in the place of narrowness, as we mourn the loss of the temple that was founded in the place where David brought his sacrifices after a pestilence, we will hold on to David's spirit in that moment, to David's refusal to accept the way things are, and keep walking. And may our walking be blessed by God and take us to good places.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yesha Koach. Beautiful. Thursday,
Thank
Rabbi
you.
Nati Helfgott will be continuing Sefer Melachim, and then next week into Nevi'im Achronim. So thank you. Shira, you want to say anything? Vakasha.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. That was beautiful and hit so many different dimensions of the book and drawing from so many different sources. And I think, to everybody, that's a piece that Rachel uniquely brings to the study of Tanach, is really pulling from so many different sources and perspectives. And if you want to learn more with her, with 929, I sent a link for a collection of different reflections that she's written on Tanach and some podcasts that she has recorded in conversation with Rabbi Adam Mintz, the director of 929. I'm happy to be in touch with everyone afterwards, but I think that blend of text, and it really brings a holistic approach to ourselves, our lives, and the way we read narratives and see ourselves in this bigger picture. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Jay. Thank you, Rachel, and looking forward to continued learning.
Thank you.
If I may, I hope I don't get into trouble for this, but I think, you know, coming from the family you do and sort of the heroism of your parents, who were in very, very narrow places. Your father was in the most narrow place you can imagine, and the width and the breadth. So I think, I don't know if I hope you don't mind me saying that, but I think it's very appropriate for you know, personally, maybe on a subconscious level, you know, you picked up on that theme, moving from the narrow to the broad, because, you know, and you're a wonderful, you know, keeping the great traditions of your parents, and you know, for what's just and what's right. So if I may say that, I hope that's okay, everybody. Okay.
You're welcome.
All right, everybody have a wonderful day.